Everyone told him he was wasting his time. The engineers laughed. The manufacturers refused to help. But a Kansas farmer with nothing but determination and a workshop full of salvaged parts was about to prove them all wrong. Before we dive into this incredible story of American ingenuity, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what happens next. In the early 1970s, farming in America was changing fast. Big corporations were pushing expensive equipment that only wealthy operations could afford. Small family farms were going under left and right because they couldn't compete. The gap between those who could afford the latest technology and those who couldn't was getting wider every single day. Now, Frank Zyback wasn't having it. He owned a modest farm in central Kansas, the kind of place where you fix things yourself because calling a repairman meant losing money you didn't have. Frank looked at his fields and saw a problem that had plagued farmers for generations. Traditional irrigation meant digging ditches, laying pipe, moving equipment constantly. It was backbreaking work that ate up time and money. The pivot irrigation system existed in theory. Water would spray from a central point while the whole apparatus rotated around it in a circle, covering massive amounts of land automatically. Simple concept, right? But nobody could make it work. The engineering challenges were enormous. How do you build something that moves continuously without breaking down? How do you keep water pressure consistent across hundreds of feet? How do you power it in the middle of nowhere? Major agricultural companies had tried and failed. Their prototypes broke down after a few rotations. The weight distribution was all wrong. The joints couldn't handle the stress. The electrical systems failed in the dust and heat. Every expert said the same thing. The physics just didn't work at scale. It was a nice idea that would never leave the drawing board. Frank didn't care what the experts said. He couldn't afford to care. His farm was struggling and he needed a solution. So he did what farmers do best. He started tinkering. His workshop became his laboratory. He scavenged parts from old cars, discarded farm equipment, anything he could get his hands on. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. His wife worried about the money he was spending on what looked like junk. But Frank saw possibilities where others saw scrap metal. The first challenge was movement. The system needed to rotate smoothly and constantly without human intervention. Frank experimented with different wheel configurations, testing them on his land during all hours of the day and night. He failed more times than he could count. Wheels sank in mud. Axles bent under the weight. Gears stripped and motors burned out. But Frank noticed something the engineers in their clean laboratories hadn't considered. Farmers deal with uneven terrain, changing weather, and equipment that needs to survive in brutal conditions. He wasn't trying to build something perfect. He was trying to build something that worked despite imperfection. He developed a system of wheeled towers that could handle rough ground. Instead of fighting the terrain, his design adapted to it. Each tower moved independently but stayed synchronized with the others. When one hit a bump or a soft spot, the others compensated. It was elegant in its simplicity. Water pressure was the next monster to tackle. As the pipeline extended further from the center point, pressure naturally decreased. The spray pattern would be uneven, overwatering some areas while leaving others dry. Frank spent months testing different pipe diameters, spray nozzle configurations, and pressure regulation systems. He made breakthrough after breakthrough, not through complex calculations, but through relentless trial and error. He'd run a test, watch where it failed, modify the design, and try again. His fields became a testing ground covered in experimental equipment that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. People drove past his farm and shook their heads. The local coffee shop buzzed with gossip about Frank's folly. But he kept working. Every failure taught him something. Every small success pushed him closer to the answer. The power system nearly defeated him. Electric motors were expensive and unreliable in field conditions. Gasoline engines required constant maintenance and refueling. Frank needed something self-sufficient that could run for days without attention. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He used water pressure itself to drive the movement, creating a system that essentially powered itself as long as water flowed through it. After 3 years of non-stop work, countless failures, and more money than he probably should have spent, Frank assembled what he believed was a working prototype. It wasn't pretty, and it was built from salvaged parts and held together with determination. But on a spring morning in 1974, he turned on the water and watched his creation come to life. The towers began to move. Slowly at first, almost hesitantly, but they moved. The pipeline rotated around the central pivot point exactly as designed. Water sprayed in perfect arcs across his field. Frank stood there watching his impossible machine work, probably not quite believing it himself. He ran it for a full rotation, then another, then another. Days turned into weeks. The system kept running. It watered his entire field with minimal intervention. The crop yield that season was unlike anything he'd seen before. Consistent watering meant consistent growth. No dry spots, no overwatered areas, just healthy crops across every inch of land. Word spread fast in farming communities. Neighbors who'd mocked him came to see the machine with their own eyes. They watched it work and realized Frank had solved a problem that billion-dollar companies couldn't crack. He'd done it without a team of engineers, without corporate funding, without anything except stubborn determination and practical know-how. Agricultural equipment manufacturers who'd previously dismissed pivot irrigation suddenly wanted to talk. They offered to buy his design. Frank, being Frank, didn't just sell out and walk away. He wanted to make sure his invention actually helped farmers like himself, not just corporate operations. He patented the design and licensed it to manufacturers with conditions. The technology needed to be affordable and accessible. Within a few years, pivot irrigation systems based on Frank's prototype started appearing on farms across the Midwest. They transformed agriculture in ways few inventions ever have. Today, if you fly over farming regions in America, you see those distinctive green circles that mark pivot irrigated fields. They're so common we barely think about them. But each one represents Frank Zyback's refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. The impact goes beyond just American agriculture. Pivot irrigation spread worldwide, helping feed millions of people in regions where traditional farming struggled. Deserts bloomed. Marginal land became productive. Water usage became more efficient, crucial in areas facing drought and scarcity. Frank never became a household name. He didn't want fame or fortune. He went back to farming, watching his inventions spread while he quietly worked his land. But his story represents something fundamental about innovation. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from people who don't know enough to realize something is impossible. The major agricultural companies failed because they approached the problem with assumptions about how things should work. Frank succeeded because he approached it with practical questions about how things could work. He didn't need it to be elegant or theoretically perfect. He needed it to run in a Kansas field through heat, dust, mud, and whatever else nature threw at it. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, not aeronautical engineers. Steve Jobs wasn't a computer scientist. Many of the most important innovations came from people outside the established systems, people who saw problems differently because they lived with them daily. Frank's workshop methods drive traditional engineers crazy. No computer models, no simulations. Just build it, test it, watch it fail, figure out why, fix it, try again. It's inefficient by modern standards, but sometimes inefficient methods lead to efficient solutions. The financial impact of pivot irrigation runs into billions of dollars. Crop yields increased dramatically. Labor costs dropped. Water efficiency improved significantly. Small farms that adopted the technology early gained competitive advantages that saved many from going under during tough economic periods. Environmental benefits emerged too, though nobody thought about that much in the 70s. Efficient water distribution meant less waste. Farmers could grow more food using less water. In our current era of climate concern and resource scarcity, that matters more than ever. Frank passed away in 1985. He lived long enough to see his invention transform agriculture, but not long enough to see it become absolutely ubiquitous. His obituary in local papers mentioned he was a farmer and inventor. Most readers probably didn't grasp the magnitude of what he'd accomplished. But farmers knew. Every time they started up their pivot systems, they benefited from one stubborn Kansas farmer who refused to listen when everyone said it couldn't work. That's his real legacy. Not patents or profits, but the practical solution that keeps working decades later. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's about persistence. Maybe it's about ignoring experts when your gut tells you differently. Maybe it's about the value of practical experience over theoretical knowledge. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just about seeing a problem and deciding you're going to fix it no matter what anyone says. Next time someone tells you your idea won't work, remember Frank Zybach in his workshop full of salvaged parts, building the impossible piece by piece. The world needs more people willing to try anyway. And you know what's fascinating about Frank's story is how it challenges the way we think about innovation in modern times. We've become obsessed with this idea that breakthroughs require massive funding, elite universities, and teams of specialists all working in perfect harmony. We assume that the biggest problems need the smartest people in the room, the people with degrees from prestigious institutions and access to cutting-edge technology. But Frank proved that assumption wrong in the most dramatic way possible. Think about it for a second. Here was a man with no formal engineering education, no venture capital backing, no prestigious connections. He had something far more valuable, though. He had skin in the game. His livelihood depended on solving this problem. That kind of motivation is something you simply cannot manufacture in a corporate research lab where people clock in and clock out. The beauty of Frank's approach was that he didn't overcomplicate things. Modern engineering often falls into a trap of building solutions that are more complex than necessary, more expensive than they need to be, and harder to maintain than the original problem they were trying to solve. Frank stripped everything down to fundamentals. What does the system absolutely need to do? How can I make it do that with materials I can actually afford and maintain? This isn't to say that formal education or expert knowledge doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But what Frank understood intuitively was that practical wisdom sometimes matters more. He knew farming, he knew the Kansas terrain, he understood what would break and what would hold up. He knew what farmers could actually afford to fix when something went wrong. That knowledge, earned through years of working the land, was worth more than theoretical expertise from someone who'd never stepped foot in a field. The timing of Frank's invention is also worth considering. But he emerged right at this critical moment in agricultural history, where the old ways were becoming unsustainable and the new ways weren't accessible to everyone. If he'd been born 10 years earlier, the technology might not have existed to make his solution practical. If he'd been born 10 years later, maybe someone else would have solved it first. But he was there at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right combination of need and determination. What's also remarkable is how Frank's solution actually became more robust because of its humble origins. The fact that it was built from salvaged parts meant it had to be simple enough to repair with basic tools. The fact that he couldn't afford expensive materials meant every component had to earn its place. This forced minimalism actually made the system better, more reliable, and more maintainable in the long run. Compare that to some of the high-tech failures we've seen over the decades. Equipment so sophisticated that only factory-trained technicians could fix it. Design so elegant and complex that a single failure could bring the whole system down. Frank's pivot irrigation wasn't like that. If something broke, a farmer could figure out how to repair it or find someone local who could. That practicality is part of why it endured so successfully. There's also something beautiful about how Frank never became bitter about the rejection he faced. The manufacturers who wouldn't help him, the engineers who said it was impossible, the neighbors who mocked his efforts, the wife who worried about the money. He could have let any of that stop him. Many people would have. Now, the human response to constant discouragement is usually to give up. Frank's response was to work harder and smarter. That kind of resilience is increasingly rare in our culture. We're trained to outsource our problems, to wait for experts to solve things, to assume that if major corporations haven't solved something, it probably can't be solved. Frank's entire story is a refutation of that mindset. It says that ordinary people with determination can accomplish extraordinary things. The ripple effects of his invention extended far beyond what even Frank probably imagined. Consider all the communities that were able to thrive because water-efficient irrigation made agriculture viable in places where it previously wasn't. Think about all the farming families who stayed in business because pivot irrigation let them compete with larger operations. Consider the food security improvements across multiple continents. All of that traces back to one person's refusal to accept limitations. Not limitations imposed by laws of physics or genuine technological barriers, but limitations imposed by conventional thinking. That distinction matters immensely. When people say something can't be done, they usually mean it can't be done the way people have always done it. Frank found a new way. Today's innovators could learn a lot from Frank's example. In an era of startup culture and venture capital and accelerators and incubators, there's still value in the lone inventor working in a garage or a workshop or a farm. Not everyone needs a co-founder or investor meetings or pitch decks. Sometimes you just need a problem to solve and stubborn determination. Frank's story also reminds us that success doesn't require permission. He didn't wait for manufacturers to approve his idea. He didn't get a license from agricultural regulators. He didn't even need to convince anyone it would work. He just built it and let the results speak for themselves. Once it was working, once farmers could see with their own eyes that it actually functioned, the skepticism evaporated. Results are far more persuasive than arguments. There's a humility in Frank's approach, too. He wasn't trying to become famous or rich. He was solving a problem that affected his own life and his neighbors' lives. That kind of grounded motivation tends to produce better results than chasing fame or wealth ever would. When you're focused on solving the actual problem rather than getting credit for solving it, you make different choices, and those choices often lead to better solutions. Looking at Frank Zybock's legacy now, more than 40 years after his death, we can see how one person's determination shaped the trajectory of global agriculture. That's a profound impact for someone most people have never heard of. There's something uniquely satisfying about that kind of quiet influence, solving real problems that genuinely help real people without needing applause or recognition. His story endures because it touches on something fundamental in human nature. We all face obstacles. We all encounter people who tell us our ideas won't work. But we all struggle with self-doubt sometimes. Frank's example shows us that these obstacles don't have to be permanent. Determination, creativity, and willingness to fail repeatedly can overcome them. The world needs more stories like this one. Not stories about billionaires disrupting industries or celebrities launching passion projects, but stories about ordinary people solving real problems in practical ways. These stories remind us what humans are capable of when we refuse to accept the limitations others want to place on us. Thank you so much for watching this story about Frank Zybock and his remarkable invention. If you found this inspiring or interesting, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this one. There are so many untold histories out there, so many ordinary people who changed the world in extraordinary ways. We'd love to keep bringing those stories to you, and your subscription helps us do exactly that. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.